الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله أما بعد فقد قال الله في كتابه المبين أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله مع الصابرين. Brothers and sisters, inshallah, on night 6 we have the tawfiq, alhamdulillah, to be together to continue our discussion upon the two parallel journeys and of course the journey of our own soul. We see that the issue of suffering is an issue that is not just existent within inside Islamic theology, but the issue of suffering is something that transcends Islamic theology. We see one of the major, if not the major reason and main reason why people leave the religion of Islam, why people leave Christianity, why people leave monotheism and theism, is due to the fact that they deem the suffering in the world that they are currently experiencing as inexplicable. So when we look at the suffering around us, when we currently look at the atrocities happening in Palestine, when we're currently looking at the difficulties happening all over the world, we see that suffering is a very real and significant factor. Therefore, now when it comes to our understanding of what suffering truly is, on this stage of the journey of our soul, we must ask ourselves the question, how can we, if we can, find beauty in suffering? Because we see that once an individual has attained that certainty in their soul, once they have understood that there is temptation, once they see that guilt enters them and after that they make the correct choice. We saw in yesterday's lecture that they must now stay steadfast upon the choice that they had made. Now when they are upon that path and now when they are steadfast, we see that they are now inundated with pain and they are inundated with suffering, they are inundated with trials, and they are inundated with tribulations. Therefore, on that notion, the purpose of our discussion today is while the soul is on this particular phase of its journey, while it has selected the correct path and it is upon the truth, now everything that is acting against it causes the individual to be in a state of pain, causes the individual to be in a state of suffering. That's when an individual is going through this, we then ask ourselves the question, is this all even worth it? Is it all worthwhile? And is there a Lord that I can justify in order to say that this, what I am going through, is something that is positive? Because we see, for example, in modern literature, if we look at the Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis, he attempted to grapple with this question. He said that in order for a God to be a God, he must be infinite, correct? If he is infinite, then he must be all good, correct? And he is infinite, he must be all-powerful, correct? Therefore, if he is all good and all-powerful, therefore he must be able to make me happy and allow me to remain in the state of happiness. If he is all good, he would want me to be happy. If he is all-powerful, he would be able to make that happen. Right? Simple premise. So when we look at this, C.S. Lewis's investigation continues and he sees that due to the fact that we can see that humans are not happy, due to the fact that we can see that there is pain and suffering, there are trials and tribulations, we cannot justify the existence of a God that is all good. He is either not all good, he is either not all powerful, or he is neither of the two. If we state that that is the case, therefore, we now philosophically have to take the concept of God away from our literature. We see this then further supported by the idea by the Dalai Lama in Buddhist circles, where if an individual reads The Art of Happiness, you see the opening sentence in The Art of Happiness is the purpose of life is to be happy. Now if an individual reads this and they look at their life and they see that I see a lot of pain and I see a lot of grief and I see a lot of suffering. Therefore, how can I justify that this is the purpose of life? And more so, how can I justify the existence of God? And therefore, is it any quandary why we have individuals leaving Islam at the rate that they are? Is it any quandary that we have individuals leaving primarily Christianity at the rate that they are? When they cannot comprehend the fact that if you have a God that is all good and a God that is all powerful, why is it that I feel pain? Why is it that I go through suffering? Why is it that I need to go through this torment in order for me to get closer to God? We alluded to the answer yesterday, however, we did not get to an actual conclusion to it. As I mentioned in yesterday's analogy, that gold, in order to purify, we apply heat to it. And the more we apply heat to the gold, we see the impurities start to melt away, and the gold comes to a higher purity. That's simply explaining it, right? However, it's not an answer to the question of suffering. And it's not an answering to the question of pain. That why existentially do these things exist? And at this journey and at this passage of the voyage of the soul itself, how can I now try and reconcile myself to state that not only is suffering necessary, not only is suffering essential, but suffering is the only means that I can attain beauty. And suffering is the only means that I can actually attain Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, when we look at the statement that we mentioned a few minutes earlier, where we stated that the purpose of our life is to attain happiness, the problem with this philosophical premise was what? In mantiq, what do we have? A sughra, a kubra, and a natija, right? When we look at this, the issue here is the statement that the purpose of human life is to attain happiness. When you have that as the intended purpose and statement, of course you would be unable to decipher the existence of a God within inside your worldview. Your entire premise is incorrect upon which you are trying to devise a theory for the existence of God. Who said that attaining happiness is the purpose of human life? Who said that attaining happiness is the reason why we do these things? Who said it's only if we don't feel pain and if we don't feel suffering, then we have attained our purpose in life? This is by no means the answer that we are looking for. We see that the Islamic definition is incredibly different, and it states that happiness is not what we are seeking. He states that contentment is what we are seeking. Satisfaction is what we are seeking. Therefore, if we see that satisfaction and contentment are what we are seeking, sometimes we see this is at the cost of our direct happiness, is it not? In our life, how many occasions have we been through where there have been difficult times in our life and we see those things have given us the most satisfaction and the most reward? Any of yourselves who have children, you would see they are by no means an easy ride. The most difficult thing an individual will do in their life is raise children, correct? However, I ask you, the satisfaction and the contentment that comes as a result of raising children, is this something that can be underplayed? Therefore, when I ask myself, am I happy when I am doing this? This is a secondary question. However, if I ask myself, is this making me satisfied? Then we start to introduce the concept of pain and suffering. And then we see why it's an important and integral ingredient in our pursuits to become an insan kamil. So when we see, as I mentioned, this modern liberal definition of what happiness is, that the purpose of my life is to attain happiness. If your muqaddimah is this, then of course there's no room for God in your worldview. So that's why when people introduce their atheism with this notion, for me, it's incredibly laughable, because it's a weak context upon which you have provided your argument. And when we look at what the actual dangers are, when someone says, what's the issue? Why can't happiness be the purpose of my life? We see that this has a lot of problems existent within inside them. One of them is what? We become very individualistic, do we know? If my happiness is now the purpose of my life, everyone else is of no concern to me. This is what's making me happy. This is what's good for me. This is what I want, and this is what I need. Now, the happiness of me as an individual now alienates the happiness of everybody else around me. Therefore, if I am to state that this happiness is now a sustainable model for the success of me and for the success of humankind, would I say this is the case? By no means. The second and the probably more insidious danger of having happiness as the goal for life, which is a refutation of the scriptures that we mentioned before, is that happiness itself makes suffering impossible. We see if I suffer, then I'm not happy, correct? So therefore, anytime I suffer, I must make sure that I get rid of this. Because if I'm suffering, I'm in pain, and if I'm in pain, I'm not happy. So every time there's a trial in my life, I get rid of it in hopes of my happiness. Every time there's difficulties in my life, I get rid of it because I want to stay happy. Anytime there's room for development in my life, I get rid of it because I want to stay happy. So we see this central doctrine of happiness being the purpose of life is incredibly, incredibly basic. And when we see the issues with this philosophy, we take this away and superimpose the word satisfaction and rida with the purpose of our life, then we can see how God can actually take place in our worldview. And then we can actually try and see how we can justify the existence of suffering in our day-to-day life. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now, looking at suffering, we see that suffering is, as I mentioned, something that we all go through. And suffering is a trial and a test that we are faced with. When we look at the traditions of the Ma'sumin, we are faced with one, which I will bring up in a few minutes. And that's in light of our divine origin. When we see the descent of Nabi Adam onto the earth that we are currently in, we see that the Quran uses very interesting vocabulary. The vocabulary that the Quran uses for the pleasures of the akhirah and for the pain of the akhirah are very specific. Sa'ada and shaqawa. We see that the terminology is very specific to the pains and the pleasures of the akhirah. However, in one of the very rare instances when the word shaqawa, the pain of the tribulations of the akhirah, was used for a punishment in this realm, was when it was used to describe Nabi Adam when he descended onto this world. Because we see Sa'ada and Shaqawa, the reason why there's a distinction between the pleasure and the pain of the akhirah and the pleasure and the pain of this realm is because we see that the pleasure and the pain of the akhirah is much more long-lasting. However, the pleasure and the pains of this realm is something that there is actually light at the end of the tunnel. However, coming back to the point, this word Shaqawa was used when Nabi Adam was described to descend upon the earth. Because we see that the human ultimately is ghareeb upon this earth. Are we not? The human is ultimately in a state that is outside our home environment, our comfort zone. We have a tradition from Imam Ja'far Sadiq, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala. Where he mentions that this very thing that you are seeking, you are unable to obtain because it belongs to a realm that you do not exist in. He's saying that this satisfaction, this rida, this eternal peace, this happiness, quote unquote, that you are seeking, the reason that you can't obtain it here is because it belongs to another realm. So when we look at this dunya, we see this dunya is on the lowest rung of the cosmic hierarchy. We see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Jannah, all of these different realms are on higher rungs. However, when we look at the dunya, it's on the lowest rung. So Imam is telling us that you are seeking and you are looking for something in this realm that was created in another realm. So how do you expect to find it? And how do you expect to obtain something? How do you expect to have this long-lasting fulfillment in things that you are seeking on this earth? Therefore, when we try to attain this happiness and fulfillment with the material things that we have around us, Imam is telling us that how can you quench the thirst of something from another realm and something you would find in this realm. Therefore, we see that the purpose of suffering is now expanded into many different definitions. But what we can conclude on this point from the introduction given to us by the Ma'sumin is that the purpose of suffering is so that we can develop, in one sentence, if I was to give you the purpose of it, is to develop the virtues of the heart. If there's no suffering, I ask you, which virtue of the heart can we develop? And I would ask you this question now. Give me one virtue of the heart, a singular virtue that you can develop devoid of suffering, devoid of pain, devoid of trial. There are very few, if any. So therefore, me as an individual, when I am trying to develop virtues of the heart, when I am trying to develop the virtues of my soul, when I am trying to become an individual who has attained these attributes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala possesses, the mercy, the knowledge, the forgiveness, and so on and so forth, I see that the mechanism for me to obtain these virtues is by means of suffering itself. The mechanism by which I can attain these virtues is by going through the trials and the tribulations itself. And when we look at what virtues actually come as a result of me going through these trials and tribulations, we come to quite potentially the most important one. And that was the sifa I mentioned at the end of the khutbah in the ayah of the Quran that I mentioned. Sabr. When we look at the key fruits to come out of trials and the key fruits to come out of tribulations, you would see that this is that of sabr. And when we look at the importance of it, we have a tradition. Again, from Imam Ja'far Sadiq, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Where he states that in the same way, if you detach a head from a body, it becomes useless. if you detach patience from faith, there is no use to it anymore. So when we look at the importance of sabr in our life, we see that sabr can now only come as a result of me going through trials, as a result of me going through tribulations, as a result of me actually going through this particular process so that I can develop this essential sifa of sabr. When we look at what sabr actually is, we see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He again mentions in the Holy Quran, Inna Allaha ma'as sabirin. And this is different to how He mentions the other virtues in the Holy Quran. For example, when He mentions the thankful, when He mentions the shukur, He says that your reward will be from me. However, when He mentions the patient, He said that you will be with me, ma'as sabirin. So we see that the reward not so much is now coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We attain the very thing that we seek, which is intimacy, proximity and closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, simply if we exercise this trait and sifa of sabr. We see in chapter 39, verse 10 of the Holy Quran, we are given a very important direction in regards to why we understand sabr to be the most important of all virtues. It states that those who are patient, the end of the verse states, those who are patient, they will receive a reward from their Lord that does not have any end. They will receive a reward from their Lord that does not have any conclusion. Again, I ask you, brothers and sisters, find me one other trait in the Holy Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions that for this particular virtue, for this particular sifa, there is no finitude of my blessing. There is no end of the reward that I can give to you. And we can see that the Mufassirin are very explicit on this point, that only for an individual who is patient, only for the sifa of sabr, we can see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says an individual who is of the sabirin, for you the reward is infinite. For you the reward will never actually cease, and for you the reward will never actually end. Therefore we see that the importance of sabr in our day-to-day lives is important, and it's a given. And we don't take this for granted by any means. And when we look at what we actually mean by this linguistically, we come back to the root letters. And they tell us sabr means to bind. And it means to restrain. And it means, it comes from the classical Arabic when a camel is moving and you pull it back. So there's something very specific that we can learn from this. And the specific thing that we can learn from this is that sabr is active to a very large degree. And it's not passive by any means at all. When we think that patience is simply not doing anything, we understand that patience is in many degrees. And patience is in many directions. We have a tradition from the first Imam, which he narrated from Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. Where he states that patience is of three types. The first type is when you are in affliction, right? When you are suffering. The second type is in obedience. And the third type is of disobedience. And he states that the third is greater than the first two. What do we mean by this? So the first one is quite clear. Patience in afflictions and patience in suffering is something that we have to deal with. Patience in obedience, what does this mean? I am commanded to do certain things by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Am I doing them? I'm commanded to do things by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Am I implementing them? By doing them, by implementing, I am exercising sabr. Am I not? I'm exercising patience. I'm exercising this restraint that I am actually going to do the things that I expected of me. That I'm going to act upon the things that I have been commanded to do. Then we move on to the third category, which is that of disobedience. And we see that the things that are direct disobedience, that are the sins, when we have the patience to stay away from this, when we have the patience to restrain ourselves from things that take us away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we see this is another element of what it means to be a sabir. Therefore, looking at this point, we see that as a result of suffering, there are many virtues of the hearts that arise. And the primary one is that, as I mentioned, of patience. And I ask you, how possibly can we feasibly develop the trait of sabr without struggle? And we see this isn't something that's just reserved to Islamic literature. When we look at academic research, such as you are all familiar with the marshmallow study, right? Where they put a marshmallow in front of a kid and they saw to what degree they showed restraint and to what degree they were able to stop themselves. They said, you can't eat this. And it was a very long study over the course of a few years, and they found that the individuals and the children who showed more restraint and who showed more patience were unanimously more successful than those who didn't. So therefore, when we look at the trait of sabr, we see that this is something that will make us successful in this dunya and in the akhirah. And when we look at how we can actually develop sabr, I ask you again, is it ever resulted from something that's not suffering or pain? Is it ever resulted in from something that's not a trial or that's not a tribulation? We see that what patience does, it allows us time in our prefrontal cortex. It gives us the time between the thought and the decision. And I ask you all, isn't this something that we would all benefit from? Sometimes naturally in emotion we respond. Sometimes naturally in emotion we act. However, if an individual has the sifa of sabr, they are now someone says something to them and they don't react immediately. They have patience and they respond well. Someone does something that's actually wrong to them, however, they respond with patience. So therefore, when we look at the roots of this virtue, when we look at the purpose of this virtue, we see that in order for us to stay upon the path of the truth, in order for us to stay steadfast, we see that an essential trait that we must have while we are on the sirat al-mustaqim is that of patience and is that of forbearance. And we see there's one other trait that particularly leans into sabr. And this is a trait that is quite interesting in the modern world that we are living in. And that is the trait of tawakkul. So as I mentioned, in order to develop the virtues of the heart and in order to develop the virtues of the soul, it's necessary for us to go through pain and suffering so that we can develop the attribute of sabr and we can develop the attribute of tawakkul. When we look at tawakkul, we see that this dependence upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's something that we are all familiar with. However, when we look at our current modern day society, and if we look at the fact that do we actually have the degree of tawakkul that we should? When we see where tawakkul actually comes from, where did I say it comes from? I said that it comes from pain, and I said that it comes from suffering. Therefore, tawakkul cannot come from comfort, and tawakkul cannot come from ease. Therefore, me as an individual, if I'm living in an era that is surrounded in comfort and that is surrounded by ease, will I develop this trait of tawakkul? Will I develop this trait of dependency on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If everything is comfortable and everything is easy, will I even question my dependency to Allah? When we look at this, we see that if an individual is comfortable and they are not going through pain and they are not going through suffering, they have no need to take the dependencies to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. However, my issue with this is this. An individual will say, what's the problem then? What's the issue here? If I live in ease, if I live in comfort, and I don't have an issue with what goes on, we have a particular tradition, and this tradition mentions that from the tafsir of one of the ayat of the Holy Quran, it states that when the individuals who are living in ease and comfort look at the reward of those who live through trials and tribulations, they will beg Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to go back on earth so that they can develop all the different forms of patience, so that they can develop all the different forms of sabr. So when we look at this, and coming back to our point on tawakkul, we see that tawakkul only comes as a result of an individual who is going through pain and suffering. However, if I'm now surrounded by comfort and ease, we see that this tawakkul does not come in. So again, coming back to the question, what's the issue? Why can't I live in this comfort and ease? Because it's not real. It's an illusion. An individual says that I live in comfort and I live in ease. What's the issue with this? Why do I now need to come out of this? Because I'm telling you that this is something that's not true. When we talk about an individual living in a bubble, we say that someone who claims they are living in comfort and ease, they are living inside this bubble. So if you are truly living in comfort and if you are truly living in ease, I ask you, then to what can we afford and appropriate the current moral decay in society? To what can we correlate the decrease in the standard of living? To what can we correlate the decrease of the levels of satisfaction? To what can we correlate the absolute negative correlation of almost every metric in the society that we see today? If you are living in comfort and if you are living in ease, why is it that we see this downward trends? Because it is not comfort, because it is not ease. We are all living in an illusion and we are all living in a bubble. Therefore, in order for us to actually understand what true tawakkul is, we must go through this trial. We must go through pain. We must go through suffering, and only then can we understand that if I am not in control of this, then who is? If I am not in control and in charge of the outcomes, then who is? If I thought my wealth dictated, my power dictated, my status dictated the outcome, but now I'm going through trials and tribulations, and I can see that despite all of my planning and strategy, it's not going in my direction. If I am not in charge, I ask, who is? Henceforth, tawakkul is developed. And the best way that we can really analogize this as we bring our discussion to a close is in the recent workings, and of course in recent times, of the pandemic that we lived through. When we look at COVID-19, almost at this point in time, it feels like a fever dream, as if something came and left and we woke up and we are moving on with our life. However, I would say that this is an ideal case study in order for us to look at pain, in order for us to look at suffering, in order for us to look at sabr, and in order for us to look at tawakkul. We see that during this pandemic, a lot of questions were asked, right? We see that the immediate response was, who is responsible for this? The immediate response is, how is this going to affect the economy? The immediate response is, how is this going to affect my job? You see, the immediate questions, and the analysts and the news broadcasters were all coming to particular questions. However, if we now sit and look at this and understand that this is an aspect of suffering, and use this as a case study of our life, where we see that in our lives we will go through pain and suffering and trials, let's use COVID-19 as this case study of pain and suffering and trials. We see that when an individual was now in that moment of pain and of suffering and in trial, what questions did we ask? We see that the questions we asked were very dunyawi, were they not? Again, what effect is this going to have on the economy? Who's responsible for this? Why did X do this and why did Y do that? Did any of us ever, did it cross our minds to ask ourselves questions that were different? We were asking questions that were with the outward eye. When we look at the basar, we see that the outward eye, it tells us what's apparent. However, if an individual has basira and wisdom, they look with the inward eye and they ask the questions that they should be asking. Therefore, an individual on this particular path, an individual going through trials and tribulations, you would see that this individual at this point in time, they now have a crossroad. And this crossroad that they need to make is that this pandemic that we have been going through, what can I actually learn from it? This pandemic that I'm going through, what questions do I actually ask myself? So instead of asking myself dunyawi questions as a result of the suffering and the calamity that I'm going through, how about I ask my question, what can I learn from this? What can I gain from this? What's the purpose of this? And how do I move on from this? As I mentioned, our response was very literal and at that point and at that time. However, when we look at the actual outcomes of what a case study like COVID-19 was, we see that sometimes in calamity and suffering there is benefit. And sometimes in calamity and suffering there is meaning and truth and purpose. So the same way in COVID-19, we see this is something that was atrocious, that took the lives of many individuals in our community. However, nonetheless, was there an actual outcome to this that was positive? Yes. We can see that the pollution levels were at an all-time low. We can see that productivity was increasing to a degree. We had the introduction, of course, of working from home, which we all are very much grateful for. However, on a deeper meaning and a deeper notice, we see that the international industrial juggernaut of productivity came to a close and slowed down. And because it slowed down, we saw all the benefits that we saw. The decrease in the pollution, the increase in happiness and satisfaction. We see that we felt better about ourselves. We were treating our neighbors with more respect. All of this came as a result of slowing down. All of this came as a result of coming to a stop. So when we look at this particular trial, we see that it's only when things came to a halt that we saw that we understood what the true meaning was, that we saw how vulnerable and frail we actually are. We saw how weak, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ ضَعِيفًا, we created humans as weak. Only when we looked at that pandemic, we truly understood that we actually have no say in the matter. Therefore, that being said, we see that if an individual was in the crisis itself, and they saw that by the slowing down of the industrial juggernaut, I have seen the quality of life increasing. Now me, as a result, coming out of the pandemic, I must now ask myself, how much have I actually taken away from this? Have I just returned back to my life as it was before the pandemic? Or have I taken something away from the suffering that I have went through? Have I taken something away from the pain that I have went through? Have I taken something away from the torments that I have gone through? So the whole point, as I mentioned, of trials and tribulations is for us to take something away from it. So if an individual went through this difficult era of 2 years and they said, maybe it's time for me to slow things down. Maybe it's time for me to contemplate and think. Maybe it's time for me to spend more time with my family because I don't know how many years I have left and how many years they have left. Maybe it's time for me to have a better work-life balance. If that was a result of an individual coming out of the pandemic, we would say that they were of the successful. However, if, like most of us, you simply went back to your life as it was before COVID, we see that the entire point of the pain and the suffering was useless in its entirety. So therefore, we can't blame pain and suffering in our life and say that this is the reason that we are unhappy and this is the reason we are unsatisfied. We see that this can become a means for us to attain greatness, and this can become a means for us to attain proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when us in our individual lives, we are going through trials and pains, we are going through tribulations. Now, what can we do in order to find the beauty in this? What can we do in order to find the meaning in this? What can I do in order to develop this attribute of sabr? We answer this, inshallah, with the second half of our parallel journey. As you are all aware, the theme of our series is the two parallel journeys. We are checking each stage of the soul and in parallel which step of the journey of Karbala it coincides with. So the stage of the journey of the soul that we were in today, as we mentioned in the introduction, is that of trying to find beauty in suffering. And I ask you, in whose example can we find more beauty in suffering than that of Sayyida Zainab, salamullahi alayha, salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. When we look at this particular point, I would like us to rewind a bit. And in this rewinding, we see that we all first need to agree on a few terms. The first term, that the Holy Prophet himself, he would never do anything without hikmah, correct? He would never do anything without reason. He was not an individual like I, where you would do something out of emotion. Everything was with reason, everything was with explanation, and everything was with purpose, right? There was not any element of his life that he did haphazardly. We can see every decision that he made was for a particular reason. We're all on the same plane here, right? If we accept this point, we now move on to the next one. And we can see that the traditions dictate that the Holy Prophet himself, he is the one who named Imam Hussein. Did he not? Another famous tradition that we are all familiar with. He himself named Hussein. So if we are to look at the premise to say that Rasulullah would not do anything without reason, he's not going to name an individual simply because he likes the name. He's not going to name an individual because there's no deeper reason behind it. We must understand that there must be some hikmah behind this. And we must understand that there must be some meaning behind this. Therefore, when we look at what Hussein actually means, it comes from the root letters, Hasana. Hasana, in essence, what does it mean, respected brothers and sisters? Beauty, right? When we look at the dictionaries, when we go through Munjid, we see that the root derivation of the word Hussein is beauty. Now, on that same note, when I tell you that Rasulullah does not do anything without intention and anything without meaning, I ask you, is it not widely and accurately reported that he mourned for Aba Abdullah al-Hussein at his birth? That at the beginning he stated that this son of mine will die thirsty on the plains of Karbala. So if he had knowledge of the end of Aba Abdullah al-Hussein, I ask you, why would a man with divine knowledge Why would a man with the hikmah of Holy Prophet name an individual who was destined for a brutal martyrdom with a name derived of beauty? What's the correlation here? What's the meaning here? And what's the purpose of this? We see that our story now goes further, where we go to the plains of Karbala itself. And we understand that, as I mentioned, the root meaning of the root letters of Imam Hussein's name comes from beauty itself. So when we see this, we go to Sayyida Zainab, as I mentioned, and if I start to talk about the fadila of Sayyida Zainab today, I would not be able to get off until tomorrow, and even then I would have done a disservice. You see, truly this is an individual who, whenever anyone raises a question to the religion of Islam, where they would try to accuse Islam of treating women in a particular way, or having women in a particular maqam, we look at Sayyida Zainab and we see all heads must bow and all tongues must silence. We see this as an individual who is no normal person. We see that her sermon that she gave was very symbolic of that of her mother. And we see that the stature she had was something that she gained from her family. Therefore, as I mentioned, the weight of an individual's words definitely comes from the status of that individual too. The same way with the Holy Prophet, now the same way with Sayyida Zainab. Therefore, when we hear the famous words every single year, that when she was asked, what do you think of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did to your brother? What do you think of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala treated your brother? What were the famous words, respected brothers and sisters? Ma ra'aytu illa jamila. I saw nothing but beauty. Remind me, what was the root derivation of Hussein? Remind me, what does it mean in essence? We see the derivation of Hussein itself is beauty, and she is saying, I saw nothing but beauty. So when she was asked the questions, how do you think Allah treated your brother? She said, I didn't see anything but beauty. I didn't see anything but Hussein. I didn't see anything but the manifestation of divine will in my brother. I didn't see anything but the manifestation of al-haq. I didn't see anything but the manifestation of as-sabr. I didn't see anything but the manifestation of al-jamil. Therefore, when we look at beauty, and when we look at suffering, and when we look at the root of Imam Hussein's name, we see Rasulullah was hinting to us all along that beauty and suffering are intertwined. The same way that the name itself is derived in beauty. And his martyrdom was something that was written and well known. Rasulullah was telling us from the very earliest stages that beauty and suffering are two things that are intertwined. And you can't have one without having the other. We can't have one side of the coin while we scratch out the other. Therefore, on that point, we bring our discussion to an end, as my time has now concluded. And we see that the purpose of suffering and the purpose of trials and tribulations is not so that we can become disenfranchised and disillusioned from the path that we are on, but rather we see the analogy that we constantly bring, that as gold refines after you put more heat on it, the human soul would refine after it goes through more trials and tribulations. We see the virtues of the human soul would only develop as a result of the pain and the suffering that I go through. And therefore we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow this to be a mechanism for me to attain Him, rather than me trying to seek and chase the comfort that we are so comfortable in the bubble that we are living in. Rather, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us one of His true loyal followers, His true loyal servants. And we invite the trials, the tribulations and the suffering, not for the sake of it and not for any reason, because the same way in Karbala they understood that it's only through suffering that we will find meaning. It's only by suffering that we will get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's only through suffering that we will find beauty. It's only through suffering that we will find Hussein. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshaAllah, to write the same in our nasib. Wa akhir da'wana walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Salawat ala Muhammad wa alihi al-tahirin.